Hello class, and welcome to part 1 of 2 of our lecture on bias in the scientific method. This lecture is going to essentially cover the information from chapter 1 in your textbook. So let's go ahead and dive right in. At the end of the previous lecture, we sort of finished up by trying to come up with a working definition of science that made sense, one that was not too broad, that didn't exclude aspects of science in its definition by being too narrow. So given what we've learned in that first lecture, we're going to try and define science thusly, which is a systematic process for generating knowledge about the world. So let's break that definition down for a moment. Systematic, right? The idea that science is applied consistently in the same manner over and over, that part of its strength is that it is not, altered every time you make an approach to try and understand something scientifically. You utilize the method in a systematic way. And generating knowledge. So the idea is that we are not generating truth, as we've discussed in the previous lecture, but we are generating knowledge about the world, our behavior, humanity, whatever it is that we're studying. So there are three important derivations from this definition that I want to talk about in the coming slides. And that is the goals of science, the key values that are associated with science, and perspectives on the best way in which science can go about generating knowledge. So psychology and the other behavioral sciences recognize that casual observation, which your book calls ordinary knowing, tends to lead to the development of personal theories of human behavior. We naturally, through observation of those around us and our own behavior, we come up with theories about why people do what they do, and that's completely normal, right? That's something that we've been doing as long as we've had consciousness. We have utilized our casual observation, our intuition, anecdotal evidence. These are all things we discussed during the previous Zoom meeting to try and understand human behavior in a variety of ways. And we develop theories, whether they're scientific or not. We come up with ideas about how certain factors are connected, and essentially a lot of times we're talking about how one thing causes another. Behavioral science is trying to take a more systematic scientific approach to knowing, which is designed to really minimize the effect of biases. Your book is going to talk a great deal about bias and how bias is something that we try to eliminate as much as we can, keeping in mind that bias can never be entirely eliminated. We always have a subjective angle of understanding. We always carry our own baggage, as it were, to the situation, and we're all capable of, succumbing to bias rather than trying to stick to the scientific method. But the behavioral sciences are trying to get away from some of that, what they call ordinary knowing, intuition, anecdote, to understand our human behavior in a way that minimizes the effect of these biases, and in a sense that gives us a better quality of knowledge about human behavior. And psychology also plays a really important role in rooting out and discrediting errors and myths about human behavior in society, of which there are many. And we're going to talk a little bit about the concept of pseudoscience as well. Because we are human beings, because we are concerned with our own behavior, with our own psychology, it's one of the areas of study that, we put the most energy into. And we have lots of different ideas about why people do what they do. And many of those ideas are based on research and are given thought to have some accuracy, but there are plenty of things that we know through less scientific methods that are proposed to be accurate in their explanation of human behavior. And so psychology not only wants to propose its own theories based upon systematic application of science, but it also wants to discredit or root out pseudoscience wherever it exists in far as claims regarding human behavior are concerned. I'd like to talk now about the four primary goals of science, three of which are mentioned in your textbook, and the fourth I wanted to include in our lecture today because I think it's important as well, especially as it relates to certain aspects of psychology. So the four basic goals of science that I wanted to elaborate upon are description, understanding, prediction, and control. So first and foremost, we start with description. You might think of description as being synonymous in this case with definition. There's a little bit of gray area between those two, but they're somewhat synonymous when we talk about the goals of science. And in other textbooks, you might often see the word definition in place of description. But ultimately, one of the core and probably most fundamental things that we're trying to do when we conduct scientific research is we want to define the phenomenon that's to be studied. And in doing so, we want to differentiate it from other phenomena. We not only want to say what something is, but we want to say what it's not. So for example, We can talk about something like memory, right? Which is obviously an area of a lot of research in psychology. How do we remember things? How do we store information? How do we recall that information? We're going to talk about a really pivotal, groundbreaking study by Elizabeth Loftus later in the class related to eyewitness testimony and people's memories of events. So, if we were interested in memory as an area of study in psychology, we would have to define what we mean. Memory is an abstract concept. We would have to say what we really mean when we use the term memory. And as I mentioned, we want to be able to differentiate among closely related phenomena. A lot of times there are constructs in psychology that we're interested in that have some degree of overlap but are not the same thing. I can think of an example such as aggression and violence, right? There is, in that Venn diagram, aggression and violence do overlap, but there are certainly definitions of aggression that don't necessarily entail violence. Our definition of violence is important in this case too, right? Are we talking about physical violence? Do you consider verbal aggression violent? Well, it depends on your definition of violence, right? So a lot of times when we're describing a construct or describing something through scientific research, we want to differentiate it from other closely related things. Another concept from the book is this idea of population density versus crowding, right? Population density is a numerical measurement defined in some way, this many people per square acre, that kind of thing, or per acre, per square mile, whatever. It's a mathematical, number that we can point to. But crowding is a subjective phenomenon, right? You can feel crowded. You might be at a concert, not right now during COVID, but you might be at a giant concert with tens of thousands of people around you. But if you're enjoying yourself and you don't have any issues with claustrophobia and whatever, you may not feel crowded at all, even though population density is quite high in that particular situation. Crowding needs to be differentiated from density in this case, and that's just an example of two related constructs, and you want to define clearly what you mean, especially if you're interested in studying the concept of crowding. Um, Another important aspect of describing something is to record events that might be useful or interesting to study. So as you're describing a phenomenon, you're also sort of making little tick marks in your mind saying, oh, this is something that I might want to come back to and look at in further research. And this can often come through anecdotal experience. This doesn't always come out of formalized research. There's a lot of times in life when we are simply observing something casually and we may say, well, that's kind of fascinating. I noticed that, when this happened, that occurred, or we might even be making some initial thoughts about causality, which is the next bullet I want to discuss of understanding. But there are plenty of times where simply recording the events or the measurements associated with a phenomenon is a way of sort of developing other ideas for study, for other research studies. Again, I'm going to mention Elizabeth Loftus. We're going to come back to her in a little while and talk about an article of hers. But she was invited, and when she was an undergraduate, she was invited to go to a court hearing with a friend of hers. Her friend had been involved in a motor vehicle accident and was in a civil suit trying to determine who was responsible for the accident. Elizabeth Loftus was asked to go by her friend just to be in the courtroom as moral support. She was not testifying. She hadn't been present when the event happened. So she sat in the gallery and watched the court case and was there for her friend, just kind of for support. What was interesting, though, is she noticed right away that supposed quote-unquote eyewitnesses, there were multiple eyewitnesses to this accident, reported different memories of the experience. They described it in different ways. And that really stood out to her, and she kind of put a pin in that. And as she later went on to become a psychologist, it became the core area of research that she was known for. So in the process of describing a phenomenon or events, we're often looking at other ways we can examine it in further study. And then, as I mentioned, a lot of times we want to describe the relationship among phenomena, how concepts are related. How is the construct of masculinity related to aggression, for example? In my own research studies as a graduate student at Virginia Tech, I was studying people's motivation for use of various drugs, including alcohol. So I was particularly interested in why people chose to use drugs or alcohol. Essentially, what was your motivation for using it? And some examples are things like social motivation for drinking. I enjoy being in a group of people who are drinking. We feel connected. We can have a good time. Some people are doing it for sensation seeking. Some people are doing it to cope with negative affect like depression or anxiety. And I was particularly interested in how your motive for that particular drug use related to how you use the pattern. Did you use to excess? Did you use in moderation? And then, of course, how that potentially led to problems in your life, things we associate with substance abuse or dependence. And that that description of how those things were connected to one another was really the essence of my research. I was also interested in how personality was related to your what types of motives you tended to develop for drug use over time. So a lot of the essence of that research was trying to describe and define the relationships between these constructs, and that is a very kind of base level thing we can do in psychological research. The second major goal I want to discuss is understanding, and this one, of course, is a very core aspect of research. We've been talking in the first lecture about how our definition of science is to generate knowledge about the world. That the reason why we engage in science is often to understand ourselves, the world around us, other human beings. And so it's really important that we are starting from a place of trying to understand. Even the earliest precursors to science, the things we discussed in the last lecture, like cosmology and mythology, these are attempts to understand the world around us and to also talk about causality, why a phenomenon occurs, basically. You think about sort of earlier human cultures, like in Norse mythology or in the Greeks. We all observe lightning and thunder, right? It's a naturally occurring phenomenon. Well, early mythology and cosmologies attempted to make sense of lightning and thunder without, the understanding of physics and science and atmospheric meteorology that we have now. So they posited things like Thor, the god of thunder. In Greek mythology, Zeus was the keeper of the thunderbolt. And so those are early attempts to understand what's going on, what natural phenomena are occurring. In science, we're doing something very similar. We want to understand why a phenomenon occurs. So causality is an idea that is key in science. It's something that's very fundamental in the type of research we're going to do. And as the class goes on, we're going to talk at great length about causality and how it relates to scientific endeavor. A lot of times we propose hypotheses that are based on causality or possible causes for inconsistencies. You look around and you recognize that some people drink and they don't drink too much and they don't develop problems, and other people drink and they drink too much and they do develop problems, right? That's an inconsistency that I'm observing in the world, and I might have hypotheses about why that is, what causes that person to drink more or less, and therefore potentially to have problems. In my case, I was looking at motivations and personality as precursors to those types of behaviors. So my hypotheses were related to that idea of figuring out why someone has problems with substances or doesn't. And so when you observe an inconsistency, we often tend to try and develop a causal understanding or explanation in our head. The English philosopher in the 19th century, John Stuart Mill, talked a lot about causality, and he posited three conditions for causality, three things that he felt needed to be present to make an argument for causality. And they were covariation, time precedence, and no plausible alternative explanation for the effect. And I will go through each of those one at a time. Covariation literally means that when one thing occurs, the other thing tends to occur. When one thing doesn't occur, the other thing tends to not occur, right? They co-vary. As one phenomenon goes up, the other also goes up, or as one goes up, the other consistently goes down. They tend to have a relationship in how they change over time. And we're going to talk about plenty of examples. A term that is largely synonymous for covariation is correlation, right? And we'll discuss that in great detail in its own chapter and throughout the rest of this class. The second condition that Mill thought was necessary for causality was time precedence of the cause. And that should make sense logically, right? The cause has to precede the effect in time. Otherwise, you can't think of it as a cause and effect. We all generally agree that that's the direction that time moves in a linear fashion, right? Now, we might get into some really high-level physics here and start thinking about some other ways of understanding causality, but ultimately we all generally assume that the cause has to precede the effect in time, and that is one of Mill's conditions for causality. And the third and final condition that he posits is that there's not a plausible alternative explanation for the effect. So essentially what you're saying is there are not any other obvious or defendable positions as to why something occurs. So the more able you are to eliminate alternative explanations, the greater strength you can make for an argument of causality. And these are, again, concepts we're going to come back to in greater detail as the class goes on. So when we're trying to understand phenomena, we're looking for relationships among the answers to why questions, right? at the core of a lot of science is attempting to answer questions of why. Why do some people have problems with substances and others don't? Why are some people aggressive and others are not? Why do some people feel crowded when surrounded by a relatively high population density and others do not? And through that understanding, we're trying to develop some general principles. And if you remember Sir Isaac Newton's guidelines for science, one of the things he talked about, the first guideline, in fact, was that our theories should be as universal as possible. So I don't want to just understand why subject A is prone to violence. I want to understand why human beings as a whole, or males or females, or whatever group it is I'm studying, college students, I want to find out a general principle of understanding that I can then apply and generalize across that population. The third goal of science that I want to discuss is prediction. So science seeks to use our understanding of causality, causes of phenomenon, and the relationship among them to then predict events. Okay, it's very crucial that not just to understand something, but then can I apply that understanding in a way that makes sense, right? And that has a value as a predictor. So we're sometimes doing things like forecasting events. A good example with which I think many of you are probably familiar is this idea. We have plenty of tests that we take throughout our lives that are meant to be indicative of our ability, but they're also meant to be predictive of our performance. A good example is the SAT test or the ACT test, depending on what region of the country you're in. These are standard achievement tests, that are given, but what they're really meant to do is to predict how you're going to do in college as an undergraduate studying in college. So the idea is that it is a predictor of how you will perform. The same thing happens as you go on in your academic career. If you go to graduate school, your GRE scores, for example, are seen as predictors of how you're going to perform in grad school. Your GPA as an undergrad is considered a predictor of how you're going to perform in grad school. So prediction in psychology deals best with the average outcome of a large number of people. We are almost always in psychological research talking about the average across a group of people, and we will discuss philosophically why that's a meaningful metric to use. But as we get asked to make predictions about specific individuals, our predictions become much less precise. So generally speaking, our ability to predict using science is to talk about how things tend to go, but our ability to predict a singular incident is less precise, and that gets more or less the case depending on what you're studying. We will derive theories. We derive hypotheses from theories, right? So if we have a theory about how things are related, we might develop a research hypothesis that predicts something about how that person is going to behave in the future. We know that people use information stored in their memory to understand, organize, and remember new information. There's some research by Bransford in 1979 to this effect. So I want to, use an example of how Bransford points out that we all tend to predict utilizing the available information. So this is a sentence that I want you to hear and I want you to think about for a moment. The haystack was important because the cloth ripped. Okay. That sentence is not terribly meaningful in and of itself, right? We're trying to use that information to predict something. We're going to be hard pressed to understand what it might be. Now, if I put that information in context, then we will quickly start to make some predictions. So if I tell you that in the statement, the haystack was important because the cloth ripped, if I explain that the cloth was the canopy of a parachute, okay, then we quickly begin to make a prediction about how those things are related. And that's just a natural phenomenon that we do in terms of our cognition. So description, understanding, and prediction. These are the three that your textbook focuses on, and they're obviously very interrelated. You could argue that one precedes each precede each other. We start at the most basic level with description and definition. We then start using the description and definition of phenomena to understand how they're related to one another, including causal relationships. We develop hypotheses about the possible causes for inconsistencies. And then we utilize that information to predict behavior going forward based upon that understanding of causality. The fourth goal of science, which your book does not touch on, but other textbooks certainly do, and I think it's an important one, is the idea of control. Are we going to use this knowledge that we have to influence phenomena? Now, outside of psychology, this is not a controversial construct for the most part. In chemistry or in pharmacokinetics development of drugs, for different various medical conditions, we certainly are trying to use our understanding of causality to influence phenomena. If we know there is some relationship between serotonin in the brain and depression, and we develop a drug like Prozac, which is what's called a selective serotonergic reuptake inhibitor, an SSRI, we are trying to increase the level of serotonin at synapses in various parts of the brain to affect that depression, to try and alleviate depression. So we are trying to use our knowledge to influence a phenomenon that was derived from research, that was derived from scientific investigation. But as you can imagine very quickly, especially in psychology and sociology, it raises some essential ethical questions. Um, the way that we apply behavioral science, can have a really negative impact on people. I'm not sure how many of you remember, but there was a great controversy, a large debate throughout the country many years ago after 9/11 regarding the use of torture, right? It became clear that certain elements of the US government, including the CIA, were utilizing things that were generally regarded by most people as torture, things like waterboarding. And those theories that were driving the behavior of those operatives was that, if we put somebody through something like waterboarding, which they believed was not, ultimately that dangerous, but that it had the threat of death, then people would give us good information. And it led to a large ethical debate because there were actually psychologists that were enlisted by government agencies to help them design techniques for getting information from people to try and prevent future terrorist attacks. And it sort of gets to this idea of is it ethical to utilize our scientific knowledge to control behavior, to influence people and their behavior, essentially. And this is the reason why, all the applied behavioral science fields require students to take professional ethics classes. We're going to talk about ethics throughout this class, but it is very important that, when you're given this tool of science, which has a great amount of power inherent in it, that you try to utilize it in an ethical manner, especially when you're interacting with other human beings, when you're influencing the behavior of your fellow human beings. Okay. A related concept of the goals of science is what are the values, right? And we've talked a little bit about this in the previous lecture, especially in the context of empiricism. But I want to focus on these key values of science so that we understand what drives scientific endeavor, what are the things that we hold up as our values in doing so. I think I mentioned during the talk the other day, during the Zoom meeting, this idea that values are not goalposts. They're not somewhere that we arrive at. They're things that we aspire to, things we're always working towards. And so let's discuss these four values that are associated with scientific endeavor. The first is sort of a key and core thing we've been discussing, which is empiricism. And this goes all the way back to Aristotle, right? This idea that we can learn through observation. So, as a value in science, empiricism essentially says that all of our decisions about what constitutes knowledge are based on objective evidence rather than ideology or abstract logic, which we might also think of as Platonic reasoning, right? He very much believed, Descartes and Plato believed that we can only understand the world not through observation, not through objective evidence or experimentation, but just through the sheer power of our reason. Well, empiricism is very much in conflict with that idea. It says that we only derive knowledge from experience and observation. And what that ultimately means is that when evidence and our ideology conflicts, evidence should prevail. And that is a core attempt to alleviate bias in how we see the world as human beings. We know that it's present. We know that it can never be entirely eliminated. So as a result, if we find ourselves trying to understand a phenomenon or make sense of it or predict behavior, whatever we're doing in our research, if the evidence butts up against our ideology, then it is important that we allow the evidence to prevail and therefore probably adjust our ideology about the world in that case. Another key value of science, which is related to empiricism, is the concept of skepticism. Now, skepticism as a philosophical construct has always existed in humanity. Formally, it's associated with a particular school of Greek philosophers, the skeptics, but what it means in the context of science is that scientists should always, and I will underline always, be questioning the quality of the knowledge that we have on a topic. This goes back to our discussion in the first lecture about dogma, right? Dogma is never questioned. Dogma is presented as absolute fact or truth with a capital T. And unlike those that are practicing dogma, we are trying to practice constant skepticism about the information and the quality of the knowledge that we have. So scientific findings, theories, methods, etc. should always be questioned. And we do this not to hector or abuse our fellow researchers, but to ensure that the theories that describe human behavior are as complete and as correct as possible. Remember the Socratic method that we discussed in the first lecture, right? Socrates essentially said that an opinion or a theory about understanding something was only as valid as its ability to stand up under a dialectic, under questioning. So that skepticism is crucial. We never believe that we have the absolute answer. We are always striving to refine and to make our theories more elegant, more universal, more able to capture the totality of the phenomenon that we're interested in. And so skepticism is sort of not just a value, but it's almost a mindset or an approach that we bring to the table in any scientific endeavor. A related concept is, a related value in this case, is tentativeness. All knowledge is regarded as tentative, so it can change. It's malleable. It's constantly changing over time. No scientific understanding is ever done. Now, we might argue, Newtonian physics, right? Certain aspects, as long as you're talking about particles that are an atom or bigger, Newtonian physics tends to hold. But of course, along comes people like Werner Heisenberg, and we suddenly understand the quantum theory of physics. This idea that when you get down to objects that are smaller than an atom, these subatomic particles, the laws of Newton no longer apply, and therefore we had to adjust our understanding of physics, at least as it relates to things that are very, very small and how they interact in that quantum field. So no knowledge is ever written in stone. Nothing is gospel. Everything is up for discussion, debate, and revision. As part of that process, the last value of science I want to talk about is publicness. It's an awkward way of phrasing it, but essentially, scientists don't only make public what they find, but also how they conduct their research. And this is something that has become more and more prominent in psychology over time. As you go back to sort of the early days of what we now recognize as, modern psychological research, you find that there is not as much detail involved in the method itself, in the specifics. So you don't only publish, for example, what you find, but you also have to detail exactly how you conducted your research. And that's an important thing for people to be able to then question or be skeptical about. But it also allows them to replicate research down the road and to try and increase or decrease support for whatever findings that particular study arrived at. There are three really solid benefits associated with publicness. As I said, people can use the results of research, right? If the developers of the COVID-19 vaccines didn't share that information with the world, it wouldn't be very useful, right? We couldn't then use those findings. If you do a study about the best way to help children develop healthy self-esteem and well-being, one of the reasons why we want research to be public is you can share that information. People can read about that, whether it's in the mainstream journal or in the media that then reports on it, and they can use that information. They can say, hey, maybe I should start interacting with my kid a little differently to try and help them become a healthier person. That's one reason. So we want people to be able to use the results of research, therefore it has to be released to the public. It also, as I mentioned, allows other scientists to check the validity of our findings and examine our methods for possible biases or mistakes or problems. And as I mentioned a minute ago, it also allows for attempts at replication, which can either support or detract from that theory. As we practice science in an area and as we're being skeptical, as we're being tentative, we constantly want to try and study those same phenomena again, either under the exact same conditions or under related conditions. And we want to see if those same findings hold, if that same theory, if that same proposed description or explanation or understanding of a phenomenon still holds when you do multiple studies on the same thing. And we call this replication, and we're going to, again, talk about it in a lot of detail as the class goes on. So within science itself, there are competing approaches to knowledge. Remember, we talked about competing epistemologies between rationalism and empiricism. You've got sort of the Plato on one side and the Aristotle on the other. And in the case of science, empiricism has largely won out. But even within that empirical viewpoint, even within that mode of defining science, there are competing scientific approaches of how we obtain knowledge. And I'm just going to touch on two here that I think are relevant. The first is logical positivism. Now, this is derived from a particular subdiscipline of philosophy, but it has become applied now to a lot of scientific research. This is the dominant position in modern American science and has been for many decades. It is essentially saying that knowledge is best generated through empirical observation, which, of course, that's part of empiricism. We observe things. Um, Tightly controlled experiments. That's an interesting concept that we're going to discuss in detail. Tightly controlled, meaning that everything is regimented and controlled as much as possible. And we're going to talk about why that's both a good thing and a bad thing in a moment. And then finally, that knowledge is best generated through logical analysis of our data, whether that's through statistics or just looking at it and utilizing reason or logic. Um, the logical positivist viewpoint says that scientists have to be almost like jurors. They have to be disinterested observers of nature. They need to remain emotionally distant from the things or the people that they are studying. They need to have a certain aloofness for it to be healthy. They need to have a certain boundary and distance from the thing or the people they're studying in order for them to obtain a better quality of knowledge. So in some cases in logical positivism, we talk a lot about knowledge being generated for its own sake. You're not concerned really about the application of that knowledge. You're not concerned about whether or not the knowledge has any real practical use or how it might be used, but knowledge for knowledge's sake is really the essence of logical positivism. And this is pretty much the dominant view in most scientific research going back for 100 plus years. One thing you might think about is how this is perhaps a less controversial viewpoint in certain types of science. For example, chemistry, right? Um, if you think about, studying in the scientific method how various elements are related to one another, how compounds are formed, then it makes sense that, you could apply logical positivism and it would be very non-controversial. But of course, we're talking in this class about psychological research, about understanding human behavior and human beings. And what's emerged in the preceding decades is something that's competing with logical positivism called the humanistic perspective. So, humanistic epistemology is basically that science should produce knowledge that serves people, not just knowledge for its own sake. Okay, so the purpose and the intention of that information should be of service to humanity, not just to understand things for its own sake. People are best understood when they are studied in natural environments rather than in lab settings. So going back to the first bullet of logical positivism, tightly controlled experiments. Well, the humanistic perspective says, when is life tightly controlled? When are we in situations in real life, in reality, in the way we truly interact with the world, where everything is tightly controlled like it is in a lab? Well, honestly, very rarely, right? There's all kinds of other noise and factors that are involved in real world situations. And the humanistic approaches says that, we need to take that into consideration. Just because you understand how humans behave in a tightly controlled lab setting, that doesn't mean you know what they're going to do in the real world. It also addresses this idea of being a disinterested observer and sort of having this boundary from the things that you're studying. Humanistic perspectives say that full understanding of people has to incorporate empathy and intuition rather than what they call sterile Dust Bowl empiricism, right? A very dry, sort of non-analytical way of looking at the world. You might think of, from pop culture, you could think of the example, logical positivism might be like best embodied by someone like Mr. Spock from Star Trek, who's always emphasizing logic and that it's important that he not become emotionally enmeshed in his ability to analyze information, at least in his service to the Federation. The idea is that humanistic perspectives say that that is not always the best way to understand or to study, especially human beings, that we need to recognize that empathy is an important aspect of understanding human behavior. And this is becoming increasingly more common as an approach in the behavioral sciences. We'll talk a little bit as time goes on about how this plays out amongst research. Um, I want you to be aware of these dominant epistemologies for three essential reasons. Like, I mean, you might be saying, why is this important to understanding psychology? Um, First and foremost, if you subscribe to one of these views very strongly, right? If you consider yourself a logical positivist person or more of a humanistic perspective person in your research, um, it's important that you understand both of them and how they relate. So, for example, if you are taking the more modern humanistic epistemology approach, right? If your humanistic perspective is how you approach science, well, logical positivism is a more dominant viewpoint in science as a whole. You need to understand its strengths and weaknesses if you're going to interpret the results that it generates. You cannot be pure in your humanistic perspective, so much so that you don't understand the tenets of logical positivism, because a lot of the research that you look at and you investigate, even if you're being critical of it, was conducted under a logical positivist sort of viewpoint. So again, you need to be aware of both sides of the coin in order to understand the majority of research come across. Your epistemology, which of these approaches you subscribe to, really determines your opinions in a variety of ways. You know, as far as which theories are valid, what kinds of research questions are important, the best methods and proper interpretations of data, these can all be related to your perspective, whether it's one or the other. And so being aware of your where you fall, and maybe you fall in the middle, maybe you can see the benefits of both, and perhaps that's the best way to proceed, right? Is some balance of the two. But you need to understand each of them in order to recognize the influence and, let's, use the dirty word, bias that it introduces into how you interpret other scientific research. Differing epistemologies lead to disagreement, even within a field, and conflicts are not easily resolved in a lot of cases. We need to recognize that these approaches to knowledge, these personal epistemologies, are closely related to culture, personality, your personal background, and dogmatic adherence to one or the other, or a lack of mindfulness, is in and of itself another form of bias, as I mentioned. Being aware of the humanistic perspective is important because it's associated with some really important emerging critiques of the validity of past behavioral scientific research. And I'm sure many of you are familiar with some of the things that fall into this heading. Things like cultural bias, right? Feminist critiques of logical positive research that is conducted entirely from a male perspective. They're having these types of criticisms, and these critiques are having an increasing impact on the standards and the proper conduct of research. So being aware of the humanistic perspective is really important because it is also going to have an influence, and probably an increasing influence going forward, on how we conduct research. And some of that comes from a very good place of trying to be more inclusive, to try and eliminate some of the biases that might come from a past in which the majority of the researchers were male. In some cases where all of the subjects were male. In fact, we're going to talk about a groundbreaking study where all of the participants are male, and why that's potentially a problem for our understanding. And of course, the researchers themselves being male, the subjects being from the dominant culture, whether that's being of white race or versus being a minority, whether it's coming from a sort of heteronormative perspective of understanding the world. So these are all aspects of humanity that are doing a better and better job over time of making themselves heard and understood as part of the larger spectrum of human behavior and human understanding. And so your awareness of the humanistic perspective is going to help you to understand why research that's conducted today might be conducted in a very different way than the way it was 30, 40, 50, 60 years ago. I want to move on now and talk about bias. And obviously, bias is a concept that weighs very heavy in this chapter, and we're going to come back to it throughout the class. Essentially, what your book is often saying is that the scientific method is a way of overcoming bias. They're essentially presenting this dichotomy, this dyad, that on the one hand you have science, and on the other hand you have bias, and that science is essentially the enemy of bias, and that vice versa. So let's talk about some of the biases that are present in our thinking. We discussed this a little bit during the Zoom meeting, but the first one, which I want to revisit because we talked a little bit about it earlier, is intuition. So what do we mean when we say intuition? Intuitive thinking is defined as judgments and decisions that come to mind automatically without explicit awareness of the triggering cues and with total acceptance of the accuracy of those cues. So essentially, this is something we do all the time. It is a naturally occurring aspect of the way our brains work, but we don't always see the gears working beneath the surface, right? Intuitive thinking doesn't really reveal the process to us, and in fact, we may be completely unaware of what is leading us to come to certain conclusions. And what really defines it as intuitive thinking as well is that we are not skeptical. We don't apply a scientific mindset to it. We simply accept totally the accuracy of that understanding. So why do we do this? Well, like I said, it's a natural part of thinking, and it's what's called heuristic based. Heuristics are essentially shortcuts, mental shortcuts that we use to make a difficult judgment. Now, I'm going to use an example of a simple judgment. Whatever room you're in right now, I want you to look at the door to that room, right? Now, the door has in most cases, the door is going to be rectangular in shape. It's going to have some form of hinge, or unless it's a sliding door, but essentially you get my point, right? It's going to have certain characteristics that it shares. It probably is going to have a doorknob or a handle of some sort of mechanism for opening or locking the door. You're utilizing a heuristic when you look at that door and when you then go on and encounter other doors in your life, right? If I didn't have these mental shortcuts, every time I was confronted with a door, I would have to examine it and figure out what it was, right? These can also be thought of as stereotypes, and the word stereotype has been associated more recently with things like racial stereotypes and generally regarded as negative, but stereotypes as a core definition of a concept is not necessarily a bad thing. I have a stereotype of what a door is and what a door looks like. Now, let me think of another example related to doors. 99.9% of automobiles have doors that hinge, on the front and open in a manner we're all familiar with. But, if you're driving some sort of, awesome Italian sports car, might have those gull wing doors that open this way, right? Some of the newer Teslas have the sort of more Lamborghini style doors that open and then slide forward and rock forward. Well, the first time you encounter one of those doors, you're going to try and apply the heuristic that you've developed for what a car door looks like, and you might be confused. Now, the next time you encounter one of that particular type of sports car or that type of Tesla, whatever it is, you will then have a heuristic in place that says, oh, this is one of this type of door. I therefore can understand it. I know how to interact with it. So heuristics are not necessarily bad. But there are types of heuristics that we apply cognitively that are potentially leading us to error, right? These are where our cognitive biases come from. These are shortcuts that we use that are systematic, and they lead to judgments in our error and our thinking. We also are guilty of what are called cognitive illusions, and this is when our thinking deceives us, and we all have sort of curious blind spots or tunnels in our mind, places where we operate, and this is maybe an example where a negative stereotype about human beings, for example, could come to play. But the idea is that our thinking can in fact deceive us. Within the modern approach to psychotherapy called acceptance and commitment therapy, I love the fact that they have all these little phrases and all these little things that you can use to help a client or a patient understand how to understand their own thinking, how to approach their process of understanding the world in a mindful way. And the old saying, don't believe everything you read. Well, they say don't believe everything you think. Just because I have a thought, I need to stop for a moment and realize that maybe it's not valid. Maybe it comes from a place that involves a lot of blind spots or involves the application of some of these cognitive biases and leads me down the wrong path. Some other ways in which we introduce bias into our thinking are things like curiosity and imagination. These are positive components of intuition. They're not necessarily bad. And in fact, we can use them in certain ways to inform our scientific endeavors, to sort of couple with our empiricism in healthy ways, like developing theories and coming up with ideas. I want you to think about the example I used in previous slides about Elizabeth Loftus being invited to that civil trial, right? She was curious about why people who presumably witnessed the same event gave different reports of eyewitness testimony. And that's a very positive component of our intuition that can guide us in some ways that are useful, but not necessarily in every aspect of science. So we acquire this through repeated experiences and learning. And in some cases, it can be considered a strength. So an example is chess masters. There are some people that are thought of as analytical chess players and some that are thought of as intuitive players, which don't really logically think through. Some of them will visualize the game in a way that's entirely intuitive. If any of you have seen that limited series that's out right now called The Queen's Gambit, they talk a lot about how the main character in this show is an intuitive player versus an analytical player, and what that means in terms of her ability to win or lose at chess. And our curiosity and our imagination can sometimes produce a discovery of patterns and connections of images and ideas that do in fact exist, and that can help us to formulate further theories about the world. But it's not always good to apply our imagination to understanding something scientifically, right? We can imagine a relationship between two phenomena, but does the evidence support it, right? That's where empiricism comes in. There are things that produce accidental and fortunate discoveries purely through curiosity or imagination. They sometimes call this the serendipity effect, being in the right place at the right time. But it can be a bias in our thinking, but it can also be a bias that we can utilize in a healthy way, and we'll talk about how you can sort of combine it and couple it with aspects of empiricism, especially in developing theories. So the power of observation is really at the core of empiricism. Science often begins with simple, non-systematic observation, like Dr. Loftus going to that civil case and observing that difference in eyewitness testimony. Through simple observation, we can like develop and give birth to questions about why a phenomenon occurs, and we can produce ideas or theories such as the existence or non-existence of the universality of human behavior. Now, this is related to a scientist called Paul Ekman. He was inspired by Darwin, and he discovered a set of 7 basic emotions that are universally expressed across all cultures, from the most remote villages to the populated urban settings. And this can be examined in more detail in your book. But Ekman basically had some simple observation about facial cues and what they meant, and then went on to conduct a lot of research to try and prove that in fact that intuition was accurate, that it was held up through scientific observation. Okay. Let's talk about the scientific method now, and what we mean when we reference the scientific method. You can think of the scientific method as the rules of research, right? They're the framework for thinking about a problem, an idea, or a question, and it specifies how information is collected, measured, examined, and evaluated, including statistical analysis. To reiterate, the scientific method is, of course, based upon the philosophy of empiricism, which we've mentioned is the belief that knowledge is gained through experience, observation, and experiment. Okay. It is a method for collecting data, which we can also think of as information, observationally, that can then be measured or given some numerical value and analyzed through statistics and evaluated in that method. One related idea I want to raise here, and we're going to talk about this in great detail as we go on, is something called Fisher's p-value. This is a very common metric used throughout science to determine how strong empirical evidence is. How much do we think this scientific finding is accurate, is valid? It's essentially the probability that the obtained results were due to chance. So if I discover that in my particular study, with this particular set of subjects that I'm doing my research on, that one thing is related to another, Fisher's p-value is a statistical means of saying, how likely is it that I've observed this relationship because it's valid or because it's entirely due to chance? And Fisher's p-value specifically references the likelihood that what I observed was due just to random chance and not to the thing that, essentially probably not to the thing that I think was causing that connection. So, by convention, a p-value of less than 0.05 is considered statistically significant, and we'll talk about what that means in great detail as we go on. What is a scientific question? What constitutes a scientific question versus a non-scientific question? Philosophically, we might say that there are 2 types of questions: is versus ought, right? What is something versus how things ought to be, or how things ought to be related to one another. Is questions are typically answered by facts, empirical data. This is really the domain of the scientific method. So questions about what a thing is, what things are, how they're related, are generally scientific questions. So the first type is generally associated with science. Examples: what is the cause of aggression? What teaching methods are most effective? What is the best treatment for depression? These are all questions that have been studied extensively in psychology, and those are is questions. Ought questions generally depend on collective understanding of things like decency, fairness, justice. They're not really appropriate for scientific inquiry, but of course they're perfectly appropriate for philosophical inquiry. And if we go back to our first lecture, Socrates really tended to focus on questions that we might think of more as ought questions, like what is the good, what is the public good, what is justice. So these ought questions are generally not questions that are appropriate for scientific investigation. Um, but science can provide some definitive direct answers to these questions in certain cases. But, for example, an ought question might be something like, is there a God? Is capital punishment moral? Should abortion be legal? These are all things that are prominent in our culture, and these are ought questions, which are generally better handled through by philosophers and theologians than they are by scientists. But that doesn't mean science can't inform those questions in a wide variety of ways. Scientific questions and their answers are commonly framed in reference to a particular theory. And we're going to go into great detail about what we mean by theories in psychology and in science as a whole. In psychology, we define a theory as a coherent set of propositions that are used as principles to describe, understand, and explain psychological or behavioral phenomena. Now, I want to break down that definition piece by piece again. Coherent set of propositions. Okay. Coherent meaning that they are logically consistent, that they hang together in a way that our reasoning can understand. Propositions are typically saying if X then Y, right, is the classic structure of a proposition. And we use these theories, we use these sets of propositions, these coherent sets of propositions, to then engage in the goals of science we've already described: description, understanding, explanation, and potentially control of psychological or behavioral phenomena. These theories tend to address questions of how and why rather than ought. Let's talk a little bit about the components that make up a theory. The four components I want to discuss are assumptions, hypothetical constructs, definitions, and propositions. So, all theories generally contain all four of these to some degree. So every theory has certain assumptions that are entailed. And when I talk about assumptions, what I mean are beliefs that are taken as given and are usually not themselves subject to empirical testing very much. We make assumptions for two basic reasons. If something can't be the subject to testing, then that's an assumption we have to bring with us. For example, the nature of reality. So go all the way back to Descartes and his meditations on first philosophy. You remember that he said, well, how do I know that my observations of the world are real? Maybe I'm a brain in a jar being manipulated by some evil scientist. Well, modern science does take for granted that the nature of reality is what it is. Now, of course, again, we can get into quantum science and much more complicated, higher scientific theories, especially in physics, and we might actually question the nature of reality to a certain extent. But we essentially believe that our senses are valid, that, while they may not be entirely accurate and they are subjective, that if I see something, then it does exist, for example, right? So that in and of itself is kind of a basic assumption that's at the heart of a lot of theories that we take for granted because you can't essentially test whether or not reality is real, as an example. So there is something to study in this case. We're arguing that objective reality does exist. We are, taking it as an assumption that people can know and understand that reality with reasonable accuracy, right? We are able to understand it. So as far as the sort of epistemology leg of the philosophy tripod is concerned, we believe that it is possible to understand our perceived reality with reasonable accuracy. Otherwise, science becomes kind of a moot point. Theory development also kind of assumes that there's an order to reality. Things don't happen for purely random reasons, and it is possible to identify causes and the processes by which they have their effects. If you're starting from a place that says it's impossible to ever know that something caused something else, then you really can't conduct science. So we begin in developing theories and proposing theories with some pretty basic assumptions. There's another reason why we might have an assumption about aspects of a theory is because the present state of research or technology does not allow us to test something. And, you know, this can change as the technology develops, as the ability to measure something or test it comes along. Then we need to then challenge those assumptions as that technology develops and things that might have been taken for granted no longer are. The second key component of a theory is a hypothetical construct. I've also been using the term concept. We're going to use concept and construct pretty interchangeably in this class, so I want to make sure that you're aware of that. But essentially, theories consist of statements about the relationships between variables. And variables in this case are defined, especially in all scientific research, but especially in behavioral research. These are hypothetical constructs. They're abstract concepts. By nature, these things cannot be directly observed, but we can attribute observable behaviors to them. So, for example, I've talked a little bit about aggression and hostility. You can't point and say, well, that's hostility right there. That's the definition of aggression. It is a construct. We have to talk about examples, or we might call instantiations of that thing in the world. This kind of goes back to Plato and his forms, right? There's the perfect noumenal realm where we have the form of horse, but if I look in that field, I may see an example of a horse, right? So we can't measure, quote unquote, hostility, memory, development, intelligence. These are all hypothetical constructs that we utilize in behavioral science, but we do utilize them in theories. We can't directly observe them, but we do believe that they are useful ways for understanding the world around us. These constructs can be unidimensional, composed of a single component. They may be multidimensional, two or more independent components. We can define constructs in a variety of ways. We do have to be careful about one pitfall when we are working with hypothetical constructs, and that's called reification, which literally comes from the Latin for thing, rei. So treating a hypothetical construct as real rather than a convenient term. We're not, not using them as explanations for behavior, but rather saying that this thing really exists without appreciating the fact that, no, this is a way we make sense of the world. It doesn't mean the thing really exists out there. It is a heuristic. It is a shortcut for us to talk about a concept or a construct. For example, hostility, aggression, that kind of thing that you're studying. We know that you then need to be able to define those constructs in a theory. It's a very important component of a theory is to define what you mean in terms of what you're talking about in constructs. So it can take the form of a narrative definition. I'm going to talk about an example of this in terms of goals and goal setting, or classification systems. We might say, well, for example, in terms of aggression, there is a famous researcher named Arnold Buss. He has since passed away. He was my introduction to psychology teacher, and even when I was taking that class a couple decades ago, he was I believe in his 70s or 80s at that time, and he was a wonderful but fascinating research in the world of aggression. He was, we're going to talk about a very famous study by Stanley Milgram about aggression, and Arnold Buss was a peer of Stanley Milgram's. He was around the same time. Well, Buss came up with the idea of his way of defining aggression was he came up with 8 different forms of aggression. So a classification system was how he was defining this larger construct. He was saying, look, aggression is not unidimensional, it's multidimensional, it has components to it, and in part of my definition, I'm going to break down those parts, those components, as a way of making sense and defining that hypothetical construct. What we're really trying to get to and what we're required to do whenever we conduct science is to come up with what are called operational definitions. These are concrete definitions of these hypothetical constructs that we can then use in research. I'm going to stick with this example of aggression for a moment. If aggression is the construct, the hypothetical construct, I might say, well, how am I going to define that when I measure it? When I see it in my study, how am I going to say, yes, there was aggression present or no, there wasn't? Well, I might come up with an operational definition that says certain types of body language are indicative of the larger construct of aggression. Certain types of speaking tone or words, threats, for example, are operational definitions that I'm using of aggression. Of course, physical violence, getting into someone's personal space. These are all various things we could use in an operational definition of something like aggression. We have to take the construct down to the operational level so that we can then measure it systematically in a study. And then finally, theories always have propositions. They always contain statements about the relationship among hypothetical constructs. This is inherent to virtually every theory. And on the next slide, I'm going to show you an example of how this comes together in terms of research on goal setting. So this is a model of goal setting. It's based on a theory of motivation and work performance that was developed by Locke and Latham in 1990 in their research studies. This is called the goal setting theory of motivation. And what it essentially does is, if you look at this, these boxes, all of these boxes, essentially include hypothetical constructs. Goal-directed effort, performance, goal difficulty, goal specificity. These are all constructs, right? And this model with these arrows that you see here is a way of explaining how these things are related. So Locke and Latham were interested in understanding how people get motivated to work towards goals, how that affects performance, and whether or not they're then satisfied with that performance. So there's this proposition inherent in their goal setting theory that you can see, which is how these constructs are related to one another. You can think about the arrows as being causal. So for example, in the first section here, we see that in their theory, goal difficulty and goal specificity are related to the amount of effort that a person puts into working towards that goal. So if the goal is perceived as really difficult, then people are potentially going to have less motivation to work at it. If the goal is specific, people have more motivation. If it's vague, they may have a difficult time getting started because they don't really know how to begin. The goal is too vague. Locke and Latham then go on to posit that that person's acceptance of the goal and their commitment to it also significantly influences their effort, and that all of these factors then have a causal relationship upon performance, and that performance is also moderated by things like organizational support, that person's individual abilities and traits, and that their performance can be tied to the, again, hypothetical constructs of intrinsic and extrinsic rewards, So internal rewards, or things that are, rewarded upon us by the outside world, and that ultimately these intrinsic and extrinsic rewards are what lead us to feel satisfied or not satisfied with our performance. So this is just one example of behavioral research that attempts to make a proposition about how hypothetical constructs are related to one another. And it's inherent in virtually every psychological theory you're going to come across in your studies. Okay, that's going to finish for part 1, and I will see you for part 2 of this lecture.